This is A Word, a podcast from Slate. I'm your host, Jason Johnson. Many of us start out our careers with the hopes of changing the world, but, the world and its problems can feel enormous. So how can activists and ordinary people confront injustice and still find room for joy and hope?
Younger people now, we have been having a lot more conversations about our own healing, about community, and it's kind of pulling people a little bit sooner into this important work, and it's becoming a part of the work.
The new book, Be a Revolution, coming up on A Word with me, Jason Johnson. Stay with us.
There's a big difference between talking and reporting, especially right now with a fire hose worth of news coming your way. You know what helps? Having reporters in the field. I'm Brad Milkey from ABC News, and that's what we've got on ABC's daily podcast, Start Here. Every morning, Start Here takes you across the country and around the world for a quick, smart look at the stories that matter. It's fast, it's straightforward, and sometimes, gasp, news can even be fun. So let's meet up tomorrow morning. Listen to Start Here wherever you get your podcasts.
I'm Jason Palmer, one of the hosts of The Intelligence, The Economist's daily current affairs podcast. The Economist's award-winning shows make sense of what matters, from our special series on China's president to our weekly podcasts on business, technology, and American politics. Our journalists provide fair, in-depth reporting on the events shaping the world. To get the annual plan for less than $2.50 per month, search for Economist Podcasts Plus to start listening today.
Welcome to A Word, a podcast about race and politics and everything else. I'm your host, Jason Johnson. It's Black History Month, the only time of year when America's ugly racial history and the folks who are fighting to change the future get national attention. But the work of challenging racism is happening 12 months a year, and it's being done by professional activists and by those of us who are pushing for progress in our communities, schools, and workplaces. So how can each of us find a way to confront injustice without losing hope or losing ourselves in the process? Our next guest has dedicated her career to finding the answers. Ijeoma Oluo is an activist, self-described internet yeller, and best-selling author. Her books, So You Want to Talk About Race and Mediocre, The Dangerous Legacy of White Male America, are staples of anti-racist reading lists. Her new book is Be a Revolution, How Everyday People Are Fighting Oppression and Changing the World, and How You Can Too. And she joins us now. Ijeoma Oluo, welcome to A Word.
Hi, thanks for having me.
I have to ask, and I was kind of racking my brain as I was going through this. What inspired you to write this book now?
You know, it really actually started from a place of deep exhaustion, like psychic and emotional exhaustion. I had been writing about violent white supremacy for a very long time, and I was kind of done. It had taken a lot out of me as a Black woman. And then I realized if I was going to take this break that I desperately needed, I didn't want to quite go out like that. I wanted to make sure that the work I left people with was one filled with community and joy. And the events around 2020 and the pandemic that we are still in really underscored how important community is, and community activism and community movement work. And it is what kept me and my family going. And I wanted to celebrate that. And I wanted to give people hope and inspiration for action, because we really desperately need action. I think people spend a lot of time reading, a lot of time studying. It's time for people to act and to see what people have been doing to really keep us going.
There's something to be said for, I think, a newer generation of writers and academics and public intellectuals and activists who have been out on the ground doing the work for decades. But I think the sort of public scrutiny and levels of harassment and white supremacist violence against people who engage in your kind of work really kicked off after the Ferguson uprising. I'm curious if in sort of your work history and in some of the work history of the people you spoke to, if they point to a critical moment, if they say, you know what, it was after Trump, it was after Ferguson, it was during the pandemic when this work reached a point where it's like, okay, I'm struggling to get up every day.
Yes, I would say especially for Black women. Black women have been uniquely targeted in these years. And I think part of it is because, Black women, especially Black queer women, have really been at the forefront of a lot of our movements for a very long time. And for a long time, they were doing this work really in obscurity, really unappreciated for what they've been doing. But once national attention really started focusing in on this work, and you're right, in 2014, 2015, Black women were really, really targeted in this specifically violent way. So yes, when I was talking to Black women who've been doing this work, a lot of what you'll see is around that time, and then around, Trump getting elected especially, they were finding it hard to leave their home. The fear that this hate that they were seeing online, it was spilling over into their lives, into their homes. There were people talking of like, yeah, I had to find a way to do this work that protected my mental and physical health as well.
So you profiled more than 30 activists and change makers for this book. What was sort of the range of issues you tried to cover? Like, how did you even choose the sort of universe, right? How did you, because I know a lot of times with things like this, you start with the people that you know, right? And then you may go to those references. But most scholars know, okay, I got to get people who I don't know, who I had no connection to. So how did you choose these people? What kind of things did you talk about?
That's a great question. And you're absolutely right. From the beginning, there were some people that I knew because I had worked with them or had been long time fans of the work that they've been doing that I wanted to profile them in the book. But then it was about research and saying, where is the really exciting kind of work that people aren't hearing about that's being done in community across the country? And so I did a lot of research. There's so many topics that, of course, I couldn't put into the book because it would have been the world's longest book. And then it was really, once I sat down and talking with people and saying, I'm really inspired by what you're doing. This is really amazing. Asking, who would you want to see in this book? Who inspires you? Who keeps you going? And it led in some really surprising directions, of connections that I didn't know existed that brought me to movement work in places that I didn't know it was being done. And so I ended up grouping it in kind of these broader categories. At first, I thought it was going to be very specific, but the intersectional nature of this work, of course, means that people are working in multiple spaces at once. But we have people doing work around environmental justice, gender justice. We have people, doing work in the arts sectors, all of these different places that are all touched by systemic oppression and systemic racism. And people are doing amazing work that is really helping people every day.
What are some of the common threads you heard in the story? We've already talked about, concerns about physical safety. What were threads that you heard as you talked to a lot of these activists and organizers?
A lot of people I talked to were long-term activists and organizers, and some people were newer to this work. And I found that a lot of almost every long-term organizer went through different phases in their work, right? They had their very fired up, young, I can do everything phase, and then their burnout, heartbroken, I can't do anything phase, and then moving through it and figuring out how this work can really stay with them for their lifetime. And so it does take time to realize you need community and you need support. And that came up time and time again, where people would get into this space where they were very isolated and feeling very alone and really burned out. And then if they stay in the work, what brings them back is recognizing that they need community, that they need to prioritize community, they need to prioritize their own mental health. And so I heard that a lot. So I heard, younger people in that space of, I don't know if I can do this anymore. I'm not sleeping, I'm exhausted. And then people who had moved through that space saying, I was there and I had to realize I needed my people and I needed to go to therapy twice a week, or, all of these things that keep people going. And then I would also say the need for conflict resolution came up time and time again. We're all people. We're all traumatized people doing work that can further traumatize us. And if you don't have good skills in resolving conflict that comes up in movements, that can push people out of movement work faster than anything else.
Obviously, the people you spoke to are still active and still organizing. Did any of them talk about people who stepped off the path? Did any of them say, I started, it was 3 of us and we were tight and we were going to change the world together, but such and such decided they were going to go be a corporate lawyer. Such and such decided they just sold out and joined some particular organization. Did people talk about those who left the path? And was that part of some of the isolation that they felt now still being in this fight when they've seen others just go by the wayside? It's one thing to retire. It's one thing to step into another lane.
Yes, it did come up in conversations where a few people who had been in like groups that had meant a lot to them, right? And so often found that would be the thing that would sometimes break a group apart. If that group started to get a lot of attention and then you had people saying, hey, come join this think tank, or come, have this HR position somewhere, or come do this thing that is outside of that work, especially I'd say abolitionist work, which really needs to work outside of systems. And yeah, there was, I think, some sadness in that loss of community, the questioning of were they really there with us in the first place? And then some people saying, you know what, I get it. This is very hard work and people are trying to do what's best for them. And maybe this is the path they need to be in. But a lot of people were very clear, like that isn't necessarily the work. It's work that can do good. It's work that can make it easier for some people to do the work. It's not the work. It has value, but we have to be really clear about the difference.
We're going to take a short break. When we come back, more with Ijeoma Oluo on her new book, Be a Revolution. This is A Word with Jason Johnson. Stay tuned. This is Jason Johnson, host of A Word, Slate's podcast about race and politics and everything else. I want to take a moment to welcome our new listeners. If you've discovered A Word and like what you hear, please subscribe, rate, and review wherever you listen to podcasts. And let us know what you think by writing us at aword@slate.com. Thank you. This episode is brought to you by Wondery. In the spring of 2017, a police corruption scandal rocked the city of Baltimore. And at the heart of it was an elite undercover unit called the Gun Trace Task Force. American Scandal is a podcast from Wondery that takes you deep into the most infamous scandals in American history, from presidential lies to environmental disasters and corporate fraud. Their new season looks at a Baltimore police unit that was supposed to get guns off the streets and reduce violence in the community. But they operated with little oversight and instead became a breeding ground for rogue cops. Federal officials uncovered a team that was abusing their power, leading to the officers being charged with robbery, extortion, fraud, and selling drugs seized during police operations. Some were quick to dismiss the arrest as a case of a few bad apples, but an investigation would later reveal that a culture of corruption was systemic within the Baltimore PD and had been for a long time. Follow American Scandal on the Wondery app or wherever you get your podcasts. You can binge American Scandal Police Corruption in Baltimore early and ad-free right now on Wondery Plus.
Shipping can make or break a sale, so optimize how you ship your orders with ShipStation. They make it easy to automate and manage orders no matter how big your business grows. And they might even be able to help reduce shipping and warehouse costs. So optimize and keep up your momentum for growth with ShipStation. Sign up for your free 60-day trial now at ShipStation.com and use the code POD. That's ShipStation.com with the code POD.
Listening to A Word with Jason Johnson, we're talking with writer and activist Ijeoma Oluo about her new book, Be a Revolution. So you say in this book that white supremacy is, among other things, a war on imagination. What do you mean by that?
I mean, a couple of things. I think one, when we think about the way in which the story of who we are as Black people, as populations of color, imagination has been taken from that, right? It's very limited. What we can accomplish, what we can do, what we have done. People really think of us as these flat, one-dimensional monolith. But also when it comes to our systems, we are told time and time again, if we want to make change, that it's very limited what we can do, that there's no way we could come up with something better than what we have. The most we could do is tweak it. Right. And white people will be white people forever. They can't grow, they can't change. Our systems will exist forever. We could never create anything better. And as populations of color, as Black people, we could never create something bigger and better. We could never rise this far above. So don't even try. And when we look at the conversations around it, everything is incremental and it's telling us, don't dig deeper. Don't think that we could have radical change. Don't even dream about it, because then you risk, what we have already, as if what we have already, is wonderful. And that really harms us. It really puts us in this, space where we are doing our part to actually help codify this real harm by saying we can, this has to stay, but what if we just tweaked it, put a new coat of paint on it, instead of saying we could really do a lot more than this.
What happens when imagination is stifled? What is actually the harm that can happen when an organization or a group's leadership or maybe even sort of the foot soldiers lack that imagination?
A couple of things happen. One is, we start accepting change that isn't real change, and we start calling it real change, and it further strengthens actual systems of oppression. So we have that. But then also what we have is that incremental change that isn't really change that people worked for and fought for, they then fight to protect. And they end up fighting people who are asking for more. And so I see that a lot, where we see people going, no, we worked so hard for this one thing. We worked so hard for body cameras, and now you want to go further? Oh no, but then what if we lose that? What if we lose the body cameras, right? And then you end up with people actually fighting real revolutionary change because they are so caught up in those little bits and pieces that they were made to fight so hard for. And they really think that's it, because there's ego involved, there's effort involved, there's time involved. They're still going to make you fight super hard for this change that doesn't really change, right? And so then we end up with all of this infighting, right? And we end up with what people often see are generational gaps. We see people turning on each other. We see people directing funds that could be really on the ground, helping people doing really important change, instead going to people doing the most, incremental, surface level change. It is deeply harmful. And it also is really discouraging, right? Because people put all this effort in. People work so hard. If we look at the aftermath of the 2020 uprising for Black lives, and we see all this incremental change that people fought really hard for, and we see how quickly it's called back. We have people go, well, why even try? Why even bother? Everything we did, it doesn't matter. It does matter, of course, but we were really convinced that these tiny little changes were huge, and it was treated like, the 2% of police funding taken from one department and given to another was taking every penny from cops, right? And we were like, yay, we got this, instead of being really critical of it. And so then, of course, when policing stays the same or is even strengthened, we think that our activism is pointless. And it's not. It's just we weren't asking for the right things. We were being sold incremental change as revolution, and we weren't able to build our demands in a way that really had true accountability for the powers that be.
A lot of people who want to work in racial justice want to focus in one particular area. Like they'll look in housing, or they'll look at environmental justice, or they'll look at prisons or food in schools, that sort of thing. But one of the things you talk about in your book is you suggest that sort of being that issue focused can be a bit of a mistake. Talk a little bit about that.
So I would say you can absolutely find the space that has your interest, your skill set, and live and work in that space and do great work. But you have to have a systemic analysis of that space. Because if you don't, the work you do can actually cause harm, not only to the work you're doing, but to the work other people are doing as well. And so if you say, what are the systems at play? Who benefits from this? How does this work on this systemic level? How is it impacting these populations? What else are they impacted by? Then you can actually do really effective work, even in just one space, so that when other people come to you and say, hey, can you support us? Or did you know this is connected to this issue? You won't say, no, I only do this, or no, that's not related. You will instead have that real intersectional, deeply rooted systemic analysis that will enable you to do really important work. It's when people say, I only care about the environment. If it's not environment, I don't want to hear it. And it blocks them from hearing all of these other things that interact with it that can actually make it so that not only are they harming other movements, but they're not even doing effective environmental justice work.
One of the things that you talk about also, and one of the overall themes, is like finding joy, finding space in what is sometimes really depressing, really frustrating, and very difficult work. I know people who do this kind of activist work, so I hear the different ways that people sort of find joy. But what I'm curious about is, how has that changed? Because one of the things you do in the book is you talk to people who've been doing this for 5 years, and you talk to some people who've been doing this for 30, right? How does finding joy for sort of older organizers and activists differ from the joy that's being found by people who have just sort of gotten into these sorts of movements?
It's interesting. I think that almost everyone I talked to went through this kind of this stage where joy was not a part of the work. It was you better eat, drink, sleep, movement work all of the time, or you're not doing the work, right? And I think it's kind of that stereotype that we have of movement workers, where you can't have a conversation with them about anything that's not movement work. And then they find that that's not sustainable and it's super harmful. Now, some people find that a little bit earlier, and some people find it after a lot of real serious harm, and they have to do a lot of healing around that. So I actually find for a lot of older movement workers, because we've long had this popular idea that movement work is all sacrifice, that if you're not, putting your body down on the line every day, you're not doing the work. It has taken some people a few decades to realize how deeply harmed they are, how incomplete their whole lives are, and how much that impacts their work and their ability to keep doing it. And so they're having to do a lot of recovery and a lot of healing. But I find that younger people now, we have been having a lot more conversations, right, about our own healing, about community, about self-care and community care. And it's kind of pulling people a little bit sooner into this important work, and it's becoming a part of the work. So it's no longer a thing that you have to do separately. Say, I'm going to go do movement work, and then I'm going to try to heal, I'm going to find joy. It's joy is part of movement work. So we're having this event, and this event might be a little brutal. It might hurt. How are we uplifting people? How are we connecting people? How are we keeping them going at the same time? And I think that that's a really beautiful thing to see. I worry a little bit about the commodification of it that can happen, right? I don't like the way in which some people sell this as if you're just caring for your own happiness, you're a revolution, because it doesn't begin and end within us, right? It is about community. It is about systems. And there are ways in which we can do that strengthen community, and make it so that we can collectively continue to do this work.
We're going to take a short break. When we come back, more about the new book, Be a Revolution, with Ijeoma Oluo. This is A Word with Jason Johnson. Stay tuned.
The history of HIV and AIDS is the history of people who were told to stay out of sight and who refused. Gay men, but also injection drug users, women, and yes, children who contracted the virus. Join us for the series Blind Spot, The Plague in the Shadows. How much pain could have been avoided had we paid attention sooner? And what lessons could we have learned? From the History Channel and WNYC Studios. Listen wherever you get podcasts.
Today is the beginning of a new year and a new decade.
The nation and the world says goodbye to the 1980s and looks to the 90s.
Kawabunga. I'm Josh Levine. Can't touch this. And for the next season of Slate's podcast, 1 Year, we're slipping on some incredibly baggy pants and taking you back to 1990. You'll hear about the single dad who fought back against big tobacco, all while hiding behind a secret identity.
I'm looking around like people were at the bus stop looking at us, and I was like, oh my God. And here comes a police car.
In Cincinnati, an art exhibit became a battleground over the First Amendment.
I remember one of my board members said, so what's this? And I said, well, it's called fisting. And she said, oh, fisting, what's that all about?
1 Year, 1990. Available now, wherever you get your podcasts.
You're listening to A Word with Jason Johnson. Today, we're talking with Ijeoma Oluo about her new book, Be a Revolution. In your 2018 book, So You Want to Talk About Race, it climbed back to being a bestseller after George Floyd was murdered. And here we are. We're 4 years from 2024. I know you have this conversation. I have this conversation. In the people who you talk to, is there sort of a sense of accomplishment now? Do people look back at the last 4 years and say, wow, that was really rough, but at least we kind of got this? Or is there a sense now that we've seen such grotesque retrenchment that people may be hitting that low spot that you've talked about before because of how much pushback we've seen since the quote unquote gains of 2020?
I would say it's a mix. I would say that for people who got into this work in 2020, they're feeling dejected. They are feeling beaten down. They are feeling like, what they did didn't matter. For people who were doing this work when Trayvon Martin was murdered, for people who were starting then and moving through all of these movements, who've been quietly plugging away in community doing this work when there was no news cameras, they recognize these patterns as part of what happens. Anytime we get any progress, even if it's just symbolic, that pushback is always so brutal. And we see white supremacist systems trying to re-entrench themselves even harder. And that's where we're at right now. And it is a particularly dangerous place that we're in. It is one historically, of course, as a people, we have been in multiple times, and we have worked our way through and supported each other through. But if you just came into this work on this high point when you were seeing millions of people marching for Black lives, and now here we are, heading to the next election that doesn't look great across the board, and wondering where did this progress go, it can feel really disheartening. And that's part of actually what I hoped to address with the book. I wanted to show people what this kind of quieter, everyday work looks like, what the people behind the scenes keeping us going looks like. Because the thing I have to remind myself as a Black woman is my existence today is owed to the continuous work of multiple generations of Black people, right? We exist because of it, because we're in a country that wants us dead. That wants to grind us to dust. And we are here because of that, through hard times. And so knowing that, I can't help but have hope. But I get where people are disheartened, and it's absolutely a thing that now, I, in my 40s, I remember, I think my climactic moment was probably the reelection of George W. Bush. Like, that was my moment. I remember being in my 20s and being like, how, why, how did we get here? This is, I've never felt more disillusioned in my life. And, now when I'm talking to young people, I want to be like, buckle up.
I want to talk a little bit about sort of your life and background. So your father is from Nigeria, your mother's from Kansas. You and your brother grew up a lot in Seattle, correct? So sort of the Pacific Northwest. How do you think your own sort of upbringing influenced how you approached activism?
I don't think I would be the writer I am today had I not grown up in Seattle. And that's not necessarily speaking highly of Seattle. Seattle is an incredibly white, it's one of the whitest major cities in the country, very wealthy, kind of crunchy place that likes to have the right bumper stickers, the right windows signs up, and yet consistently ignores the incredibly big gaps in education for populations of color, homelessness rates. It loves to act like its poor population doesn't exist, its Black population doesn't exist. And I grew up in that. And so where I say I wouldn't be the writer I am today if I hadn't grown up here, it's because I had to be so observant. This is not a space that's going to tell you to your face what they think of you. This is a space where you have to learn and watch what people do, because everyone says they voted for Obama. Everyone recycles, but they will pass you over for a job. They will cross the street to avoid you. They will call you angry the moment that you have an opinion that people don't agree with, right? And I had to be like, what's going on here? Because people are saying one thing and they're doing another. And so for my own survival, being the only Black kid in almost every class I was in until 6th grade, right? Being called angry more times than I could count for just having an opinion, all of these sorts of things, I had to be very observant to learn. And it helped me realize the real danger in not being upfront and honest, not having these conversations, how much danger it really puts Black people and other populations of color in, and how easy it enables white people to be able to be a part of harm and not know it. They could just easily say, I did this thing, I don't have to do anything else. And anything that makes me uncomfortable is an act of violence against me, right? And Seattle really has that ethos. And so for me, my general frustration, why I started writing was, when Trayvon Martin was murdered, I was watching people go, oh, that's so sad. Aren't you glad you don't live in Florida? And not recognizing how unsafe I felt every day, how much I didn't want to send my kids off to school, how worried I was for my brother, who's a 6'4" Black man who was on tour at the time, and being handcuffed by police, and things like that. And being like, don't you understand that this place is no safer? And every day, it's big or small, part of my life is being chipped away by the white supremacy here. And that's really what I was trying to communicate. And that's really why I started writing.
You mentioned this before with some of the activists and organizers. Here we are, we're in 2024. There's a real tension in a lot of the sort of organizing and activist community, certainly with Black and brown folks, about voting, whether or not it matters, whether or not you should put your time and effort into it, whether or not you are voting to get something or you're just voting to reduce harm. What are some of the sentiments that you got from the people you spoke to in the book about the value or purpose of voting? Because I think for people coming out of a generation when you couldn't, right? They obviously view it differently than Gen X or even Zoomers today.
I would say it was a mix, but the one consensus I will say is when I asked people, what advice would you give people? No one said vote. It just didn't come up. People weren't saying don't vote. But when they were thinking about priorities and what was making a difference in communities, people would say, like, show up at a school board meeting. And I think that is a difference. There is a local national split. I think that right now, I think everyone kind of can see clearly that if you're looking at national politics and think that you're going to change the world on that level, it's probably not happening. And at most, you're trying to do some harm reduction. On a local level, it's a mix. There is some definite harm reduction that needs to happen because a lot of our more oppressive laws are tested on a local level first before they're brought nationally. And we have to be aware and we have to be fighting that. But also, there are some real progressive pieces of legislation that can be passed. And they need support, and we need to look for those. And so looking at who's in your school boards, who's in your city council, looking at these local initiatives, looking at things where we're trying to sneak in police funding, all of these sorts of things, being aware really does matter. But also knowing that the real work, where we're going to find new ways, where we're going to support real solutions, and where we're going to really keep people alive and thriving is being done outside of that system. So we really have to do both. And people thinking just vote is going to fix it. How many times have we heard that?
If somebody's reading your book, right, when they get to the end of it, let's say they're not an activist, right? Let's say they're the person's like, look, I've been to one, I went to one school board meeting because my 13-year-old was mad about school lunches, right? Or, I went to one protest once, back in 2014 because my church youth group was talking about this, that, the other. For the vast majority of Americans who are essentially bowling alone, right, and don't do this kind of engagement, what do you want them to take from your book? Because it's going to be a different experience for them than the organizers like, oh, God, thank you, because I was figuring out how I was going to deal with my depression. What do you want regular people to take from your book?
One, I want them to recognize themselves in some of the movement workers in here. There are a lot of people who really never thought they would be doing what they're doing, right? But also recognizing that there are a lot of people doing this work that would just love your support, that would love for you to come out to an event. And at those events, you'll find community. You'll find people who share your values. You'll know you're safe. You'll have a lot to build off of. So for a lot of people, if you're not ready, trust me, there is a space for you to support this work if you want to meet it there. And people need your support. So a lot of the people profiled are some of the most underfunded and yet vital movement workers we have. And they would just love for you to share what they're doing. They would love for you to show up at a community event they're hosting. They would love any of this support, and it would mean so much. And in fact, it would mean more than throwing some money to these big national orgs, because people on the ground would feel it. These are the people going to people's homes and making change, right? Working with people one-on-one and making a real difference. You can support them, you can find community around them, and there's always a place for you. And I really hope that people get that, you don't have to have a particular degree. You don't have to be willing to be out in the streets every single day. There is always space for you in this work if you want to do it.
Ijeoma Oluo is a speaker, activist, and author. Her latest book is Be a Revolution: How Everyday People Are Fighting Oppression and Changing the World. Thank you so much. I really, really enjoyed this conversation.
Thanks for having me.
And that's a word for this week. The show's email is aword@slate.com. This episode was produced by Kristie Taiwo-Makanjuola. Ben Richmond is Slate's Senior Director of Podcast Operations. Alicia Montgomery is the Vice President of Slate Audio. Our theme music was produced by Don Will. I'm Jason Johnson. Tune in next week for a word.
When you earn your degree online at Arizona State University, you get everything the nation's most innovative university has to offer. The same internationally recognized faculty, the same nationally ranked programs, the same degree. Learn more at asuonline.asu.edu.